Hey folks, welcome back to the show. We have a fantastic episode for you today, as always. Before we jump in, I want to thank you for being here, and I would love to invite you to check out natnitum.com because that's where you get to learn more about my membership community, which is a private membership community. Do lots of live Q&As in there. I bring in all kinds of experts to do live Q&As. A lot of the guests from the podcast come in and we get to talk about whatever we want because it's a private membership community. So not much in the way of censorship over there other than just good manners and good attitude. Beyond that, also on the website, you can sign up for my newsletter, which people keep telling me they totally love. We do little snapshots about the episodes. I talk about biohacks I love right now. We even have a special peptide edition of the newsletter that you can choose if you're into peptides. So lots of fun stuff there. So that's natnitum.com. And of course, if you're enjoying this episode and this podcast in general, please make sure you leave us a review on whatever platform you are listening or watching it on, because that is how we rise up the ranks and reach more people just like you. All right, let's talk a bit about this episode. Welcome to the Longevity Podcast, which I already did, the show where we chew on the meaty topics of life, literally and figuratively. Today's guest, Michael Kummer, is here to spill the beans, or maybe the bone broth, because he's not big into beans, on two fascinating topics: the art of embracing discomfort in our overly cushy modern lives, and why organ meats might just be the ultimate multivitamin that nature always intended us to have. Michael dives into everything from the survival hacks of ancient humans, what's in season, what's native, what won't kill me, that was the shopping list, to the nutritional treasures hidden in liver, heart, and other underrated cuts of animal meat. Trust me, he makes it sound way more appetizing than your grandma's mystery stew. Now, I got to tell you guys, personally, I'm a huge fan of certain organ meats. You just got to learn how to cook them. But plus, he'll share why cold plunging or eating in alignment with ancestral wisdom might just be the secret sauce to thriving in today's crazy world. So grab a warm cup of bone broth and get ready to rethink how we eat, move, and live. To learn more about Michael Kummer, you can go to michaelkummer.com. That Kummer, it's Kummer. And to try Michael's amazing organ supplements, is like a beautiful line of organ supplements. You can go to shop.michaelkummer.com and you get to use code NAT1515 to save 15% off your purchase. Michael is also the host of the Primal Shift podcast, another great podcast. All right, let's jump into the episode. Hey folks, just a quick reminder that all of the information presented in this podcast is for information purposes only. No medical advice, no diagnosing, no treatments suggested here. Before you try anything that you hear about or learn about here, make sure that you check with your medical provider. Michael Kummer, welcome to the podcast. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Natalie. I appreciate it.
Yeah, well, we were, as you know, the first person who told me, Nat, you should have this guy on your podcast is someone who used to work for both of us. She still works for me.
Right.
But she used to work for you as well. Mm-hmm. And that's who used to be our mutual producer. And I was like, oh yeah, sure. And then as it turns out, somehow I was signed up to your newsletter. Really? Not knowing who you were. And so I went back and I started reading these later. I'm like, oh yeah, he's an interesting guy. And he talks about organs. And I think organs are really cool. So maybe there's something there. So anyway, so I'm really excited about this conversation. Also, I think that, when I first looked at some of your stuff, I was like, this is going to be one of those like eat only meat people. I'm not sure if we can do this. But actually, talking to you before the podcast, I'm really excited about the conversation because I think that there's two things going on in the world in this polarization world that we're in. And I think that just as concerning as the only way forward is to only eat meat is the weird political agenda that seems to be unfolding around almost making meat unavailable to people as a food. Yeah. And I think that actually scares me the most.
Yeah.
Because I think one thing the two of us are going to agree on is, the integral position that animal protein has played in human evolution and currently in human health as well.
At least for those who believe in evolution, I've no idea how much heat I've gotten for suggesting that we've been around for millions of years.
Yeah, well, I guess if you want to believe something else, you can do that. Nevertheless, for as long as we've known humans to be around, whether that's 10 minutes or a billion years, the thing that I keep saying to people is, here's the news. For most of our history, we never had the luxury of choosing what we ate. We basically got to eat what we could catch and what didn't kill us first.
Correct.
Right? So,
Yep. I actually, recorded an episode the other day and said, go with me in the thought experiment, just eat what you can find around you and what's in season,
Yeah.
And what's really, if you want to take it to the extreme, what's native to the place that you live in, right? Your options are very limited, in particularly in winter, and so there is no question what we would have eaten during certain times of the year in certain, regions of this planet, because those are the options, and you either, get that or you die. That's as simple as it is. You don't really have to have a discussion. Are you vegan or 100% carnivore? It's likely neither of those, but it's very much meat leaning during certain times of the year, right? Where nothing else is growing.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think that brings up another interesting point, and that is ethnicity, right? Because depending on what part of the world you come from, that would be more or less pronounced.
Correct.
Right.
Yep,
so my background comes from a part of the world where things grow all the time. So is it possible that in my generational history, if you want to call it that, there might have been less emphasis on meat, right? There might have been more emphasis on things like fish and other foods. But nevertheless, as we discussed earlier, like in my grandmother would make organs all the time, some of which I loved, some of which I didn't, but they were a cornerstone of my diet growing up. And I think that I think that there are certain people that would say, well, now we have a choice, but I think that moves us away from, what got us to where we are today, what allowed our brains to develop the way that they did. And I'm pretty sure that nutrient density played a big role in that.
Yeah. I read an interesting comment today saying that aging is how do they call it? Well, as you age, you seek more and more comfort. I don't know exactly what the exact, so I'm paraphrasing, but you seek more and more comfort, and seeking more and more comfort ultimately is what causes us to age, right? And the same, similar goes with food and having choices. Yes, now we have, access to food-like substances that aren't really food. We have access to staying indoors under artificial light, but that choice doesn't necessarily mean it's most conducive to optimal health, And I think you have to seek that discomfort in the sense of, seek what previous generations were exposed to and had to deal with in order to kind of follow the path of human history where we've gotten where we are today. And now in the last couple of 100 years in particular, we seem like to be falling apart. I mean, who, is a warrior anymore? Everyone is, sick and can't even walk straight and falls apart if they have to do 2 squats or a couple of push-ups. None of this is normal for humans, And so, now we have the choice, but we have the choice to also, I think, the obligation to choose wisely if we want to maintain our health.
I mean, you're alluding to a very interesting concept, and I think this was something that you wanted to talk about, which I think is really important. And I have a good friend whose tagline is "Your comfort zone is killing you."
Yeah.
And I think it's so brilliant, right? Because to your point, if we shelter ourselves from any kind of discomfort, which, as you say, we have the opportunity to do now. We certainly, those of us who are fortunate enough to be well off enough to live in certain places, we have air conditioning when it's hot. We have heat when it's cold. We can stay inside all the time. We don't ever have to skip a meal because all the food is available to us. we're faced with hyperpalatable foods that not only are available, but are calling our name at every minute of every hour of
Right.
every day.
Right.
And it puts us in a world where this whole notion of hormesis becomes or hormetic stressors becomes very elusive. And maybe you want to speak to that a little bit, because I know that that's something that you talk about quite a lot.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's, absolutely true. In fact, the sad reality is that now we have to go out of our way to cold plunge, to sauna bathe, to do all of the things that should really be part of our normal life. If it's cold outside back in the days, well, you were cold inside too, because you didn't have, heat. Maybe you had fire for a while, but, if it was hot, it was hot. There was the natural exposure to those stressors, if you wanted to or not. Now, we have to make it, today I have to cold plunge, because otherwise I'm not going to get my cold exposure. It's kind of crazy if you think about it. We have to jump through hoops to, live a life that's somewhat comparable to, how earlier humans, would have lived, without doing anything special,
Yeah.
And that's kind of it's kind of fun in because you can really, choose to bounce back and forth between both worlds. You can be comfortable when you want to. I think, at the end of the day, there is probably a net positive that you have a choice to, have you can go into your warm home and you're fine for a moment to, decompress, and, you don't have to be fighting that saber-toothed tiger, 24/7 in the cold. You have a choice. But that choice comes at a price, and you really have to keep that balance in mind. Just staying in the comfort zone all the time is going to kill you, literally speaking, over time.
Yeah.
So you kind of have to seek the discomfort and make it a part of your regular routine.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
no,
most people are not willing to do that.
Yeah, no, I'm 100. And it's interesting you said that about coming in to be warm, because, obviously our ancestors didn't live the lives that we're hoping to live. Like, the current obsession, again, in places where we have the luxury to have these obsessions, is now we want to live a really long time, and we want to continue to be vital.
Right.
And so, we want to be in our 90s as able and as sharp and as physically mobile as we were, let's say, in our 50s, right?
Yeah.
And I think that there are certain cultures that actually have that. And ironically, and the Swiss come to mind. And ironically, these are the cultures that practice as part of their lifestyle these extremes, right? These are cultures where cold plunging, cold exposure, sauna are very much a part of their day-to-day life.
I mean, all over, Scandinavia, that's just, it gets freezing cold up there. And guess what they do? They strip naked and jump into the frozen lake. I mean, who does that here in the US? I mean, there are people who do that, but those are really the outliers that know they have to do that to do better. But, over there, it's, that's just what you do, and your kids are raised that way, and they see it from the get-go, and for them, it's just a normal part of life, and that's what it should be,
Yeah. I wonder if maybe... I will tell you, I have cold plunge. I hate it with a passion. It is not my happy place. I'll sit in a sauna till the cows come home. I'm not a cold plunge. I'm not a willing participant in cold plunging. And I do wonder if and I have no problem swinging kettlebells around and doing push-ups and squats and doing all the things. But I do wonder sometimes, and I've never had time to really dig into it, if maybe there are some depending on your background, if maybe cold plunging may be more beneficial to some people than others. If we follow that storyline of nutrition and your origins, like being Mediterranean, cold exposure would not be a thing. And like I said, I'll do it when I have to, but I'm going to go on the record right here, right now. I'm not the cold plunging queen. People have said to me, hey, why don't you get a cold plunge at your house? And I'm like, because it would turn into a flower pot. I
think you're absolutely right. I think there is a strong genetic component to everything that we do. It wouldn't make sense if it wasn't, and the second nuance of this, I think also from looking back, however far back you want to look, it was probably more likely that men would have exposed themselves to certain stressors, fighting that saber-toothed tiger or jumping into the lake to get the fish or whatever the case might be. And I would argue that maybe, women with a different, hormones and just a different really body, different physiology might have to approach those stressors differently, be it either at a warmer temperature or maybe not at all, or maybe not during certain times of the menstrual cycle. I mean, there are so many factors that I think you have to take into account. And ultimately, if you're somewhat in tune with your body, you know what's right for you and what isn't. There are certain foods that are supposed to be good or okay, like, let's say a banana. Our son cannot have a banana. He gets soft stools, I mean, it doesn't matter how many people tell me bananas are good for you. Not for him, apparently, And so the same, I think, applies to cold plunging and to heat exposure. My wife is the same. She's Costa Rican, and she is, not super happy with the cold. Unless we crank it up to like 55 degrees or so, which is, way above my, 37, 39, that I feel okay in. She doesn't, and forcing it, I don't think is a feasible strategy and a helpful strategy at all now.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And it's interesting you mentioned 55, because somewhere between 50 and 55, I'm okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You take it much, and I would argue that I'm still getting the stressor.
Yeah.
I'm still getting the shock. I'm still getting the stressor.
Yeah.
And I think that, there's this kind of macho thing going on with cold exposure right now where, if you have to hack your way through a layer of ice and then get in there.
And it's, all of that is good fun. I mean, I recorded a whole review of a cold plunge while inside the cold plunge. I was 15 minutes in there. At the end, I was slurring my words, so definitely.
Okay, well, at least you're human.
Yeah. And, but, it's fun if you do it, but I would not, suggest, hey, this is what you need to do to get your benefits. I think this is complete, BS, and you just need to listen to what feels uncomfortable, but not to the extent where, you're falling apart and your brain is thinking, you're on the Titanic, and you do that every day, in addition to all of the stress that you're already exposed to. That can't be good. You're pushing it way beyond, what's supposed to be a hormetic stressor that's supposed to make you stronger, right? I think by doing that, you're just gonna go down the drain, and not help yourself.
I love it. 100%. All right. We're on the same page. We can hang out. All right. Let's talk about food, because I think food is another, this is another defining feature. And you live a certain way, your family moves in that way. I'm curious to know if your wife eats the same way as you do, but
she does.
She does. Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about that, because when I asked you what's your diet like, you said, what did you say? We're meat-based. Mm-hmm. It's a meat-based diet.
Yeah.
But you were pretty quick to say that it doesn't necessarily always exclude everything else. Correct. And so maybe you want to talk about that a little bit and how you came to this. Like, were you always this way? Were you raised that way, or did you come to it later in life?
No, I was raised on dumplings and potatoes in Austria, with meat as well, but that wasn't really, the main thing. So no, I was raised on the standard Austrian diet, if there is such a thing, which is, I think, significantly better than the standard American diet. At least it was back in the days. Mm-hmm. But, never really cared much for nutrition or understood the impact that food has on my health. I used to be a professional athlete in my early 20s. And it never even occurred to me a bit that what I eat and how I sleep impacts my performance, And it really took until I moved to the US, and a couple of years into, moving to the US, and I, looked in the mirror, I'm like, well, I guess my body is starting to look differently than it did before. I was pretty, ripped when I was an athlete. And then I, started accumulating more fat. I was never obese or anything, but now looking at those pictures, I'm like, fat slob, I would call myself,
You were getting soft. Let's just say that.
Yeah. And, and I'm like, okay, but that wasn't even reason enough to change anything. And then I met my wife, and she was diagnosed with pre-diabetes. And had constant headaches and stuff. And we saw a documentary on Netflix about the amount of added sugar that the average American, I guess us included, would consume annually. And we said, this is absolutely nuts. And, sugar is the cause of all, bad thing that might happen to us and that's currently happening to us. So we went through our pantry, removed all the products that had added sugars, and then we were fine, and her symptoms improved. Everyone was happy. And along the lines, we met someone who was on a paleo diet. And never really talked about much about it, just ate differently. And, every so often I would ask a question and say, okay, well, why are you not eating this? Or can you eat this? The typical questions you would get if you eat differently.
Yeah.
And at some point I'm like, you know what? I think this guy is onto something. We are supposed to eat how humans have been eating for a long time. So I told my wife, I'm going to do paleo, and she's like, well, you do realize that I'm the one, who is cooking. And so if you're doing paleo, that means I have to cook differently for you. I'm not going to do that. And I'm like, well, you have to, because otherwise, we're all going to die.
No drama.
No drama. No. And I'm not so much anymore, but I used to be a fairly black or white kind of guy. I'm like, if I do this, I'm going to do it. I'm going to bulldoze over everything that's in my way. And so we had a huge fight. And then, I'm like, okay, whatever, I'm not going to do it. I'm just accept, my early demise and, whatever.
Oh my God, that conversation. All right.
Yeah, it wasn't pretty. No. And she started doing her own research and then said, you know what, I think you're right. We got to change the way we eat. It's not sustainable. And so we embraced paleo. Then our daughter was born and we did it for a while. And then I discovered keto. I don't know where or how. I think it was on a Paleo FX or whatever trade show that I went to. And I'm like, ooh, paleo was okay, but keto is what we have to do. This is the holy grail. So I went back there and said, starting tomorrow, I'm going to do keto, no more carbs for me. And she's like, and we had kind of the same discussion again, because I'm like, I'm not going to, we just started eating, zucchini and sweet potatoes and all of those things. And now we can't have that anymore. I'm like, nope, it's not keto friendly.
Poor wife. And once again, you told her, fine, you're going to kill me. Be that way.
Yeah, it was kind of like, I gave up. I was, I wasn't depressed, but I was not happy. And then, she again did her research and like, you know what, I think you're right. We're eating way too many carbs, and funny enough, then during my paleo period, I had IBS for irritable bowel syndrome for most of my life. My dad has had it, well, still has. And his dad died at 48 of colon cancer. So we have like gut issues in the family. And I started paleo and suddenly within less than 2 weeks, all my issues were gone. I'm like, holy moly, this is all food related. And so that really sparked my interest in correlating food intake with how I feel. And then a while into keto, all of the symptoms came back to a lesser degree, but they returned. And now looking back, it was probably because of all the keto-friendly nut butters and, all of the stuff that's keto-friendly, but not really conducive.
You were doing dirty keto. Yeah.
Well, I was doing the good oils and the good fats and stuff, but nuts were like, there was nothing wrong with nuts. Nobody ever told me that maybe, eating only, almond flour and, almond nut butter might not be that great either. And so, long story short, I came across, carnivore. I'm like, ooh, carnivore. That's exactly what we need to do because keto is BS. That's way too, so but at that time I told my wife, I said, don't worry. We don't have to do all carnivore. I'm just going to try it out for a couple of weeks, and I did that.
I love this story. Okay, keep going.
So I did carnivore and, all my symptoms disappeared again. And then I think I stumbled across Saladino at some point, met him then in Costa Rica. And I'm like, okay, it's not only about, just eating meat. There are certain plants that are maybe better for us than others. And then I met Bill Schindler, Dr. Bill Schindler, who talks about how you can process certain foods to make them less problematic, fermenting, sprouting, soaking, all of those things, which humans have acquired over, a long time to figure out how to, make certain foods work to extract more nutrients and mitigate some of the anti-nutrients and other chemicals that are in there, that plants use to deter you and animals from eating them, right? Especially the vital parts of the plant. And so I'm like, okay, so with that framework, I think we can make it work, as a family with the kids and, everyone involved. And so we adopted an animal-based framework and really then within that framework, figured out, okay, what works for us, what doesn't, what works for the kids versus what works for us, how much of certain things can we have before running into issues that are noticeable, like, GI issues or what have you, maybe, you suddenly get pimples if you eat too much of, certain foods. All of the signs that your body sends you to say, hey, this is not great for you. And we kind of figured that out. And now we have this, meat-based framework. I mean, we eat, I am a firm believer that protein is one of the most important macronutrients, especially since we're all active. We do CrossFit, we work out a lot. So we need proteins for structure, for, hormone production, for 1,000 other things, not just building muscle tissue. We also need a lot of fat for various reasons. The only thing that we kind of, is optional that we can play with as an energy source is carbohydrates, and that's kind of how we see it, get most of the essential macros and also micros from animal-based sources and then play with the rest, whatever is left there in terms of, caloric intake, in terms of, I want to have today, I want to, have a certain taste, a certain flavor, what have you. That's kind of where we fill the gaps with non-animal, with plant-based foods at the end of the day.
Right. And so with your kids, are you they're obviously they're going to be eating meat, which I, massive fan of that for kids. But do they eat more on the paleo spectrum than maybe you do? Because at the end of the day, I mean, you did well on paleo, by the sounds of it, right? And so in terms of your paleo, probably did it include eggs and dairy, and basically you just kicked out grains? It's interesting you mentioned nuts and keto, because usually where people get in trouble with nuts is on paleo.
Yeah,
right? Because
and it was more than nut butter, I think, and baking with nut flours, I think, what got me in trouble. And that's a whole nother argument, because having a handful of nuts is a completely different argument than eating a jar of nut butter,
Oh, yeah.
Or
sure.
Baking with nut flours, which, the surface area and the concentration of what you're getting. I mean, I don't know how many nuts you need to grind to get a, pound of nut flour. Probably a lot, more than you would ever eat,
Well, I've always thought, when I went paleo for a while as well, and I'm still kind of in that sphere, kind of more of a Mediterranean-based paleo, if you will.
Yeah.
But I remember for a while, and this did not make me popular in my house, I would only buy nuts still in their shells. And
right.
So my husband and my son were like, what are you doing? Like, how are we supposed to eat these nuts? I'm like, you're supposed to crack them.
Yeah, that limits your intake.
But that's too much work. I'm like, I know. So here's what's going to happen. Instead of having a jar of walnuts or almonds, you'll have like a few, and then you're going to get tired of cracking them, and then you're going to move on.
Exactly. And that's the same goes with even, with foods that I just don't eat, like spinach, leafy greens in particular, that stuff that's high in oxalates. They don't taste good to me, and I don't see really the benefit of consuming them. But if you were to say, okay, I'm going to eat those once a year while they're in season, probably nothing bad is going to happen to you if you're somewhat metabolically healthy, But having it every single day, in a smoothie, a raw green smoothie kind of thing, it's a different argument, and so it's where the nuance gets lost, no spinach ever. Well, I mean, ideally, you don't really need spinach in your life, but if you do, and you have it in season and it's fresh, and maybe you grew it yourself, having that once every so often, it's probably not going to kill you,
Well, it won't kill most people. And, the oxalate discussion, I think, is interesting because there's nuance, there's differences amongst people. Some people do have the gut bacteria to break down oxalates, and many people don't. So do those people have a better gut microbiome than the people who don't? I don't know. Right. There may be different reasons for different things, but to your point, I think what happened was, it's kind of like when kale was the superfood and everybody was having kale all the time and they were having it raw, and it was kind of like a Brillo brush in your gut.
Yeah.
For me, I would only ever eat kale if it had been massaged and left overnight to break down the fibers. But it's I don't know. I think it's like human nature. We discover something and everybody jumps on the bandwagon and that's the thing. And we're just going to do that one thing until there's something else. And then we're going to go over there. And I think, to your point, the only time maybe to have a little bit of that in your life is if you're going to go with seasonal eating.
Right.
Right. And there's an argument for seasonal eating. I think in the summertime, we have longer days. We're exposed to more light. The light is different. there's people that would say that our biology can tolerate more of those sugars in those foods. Right. But I also think that eating for where you are might also, and where we get in trouble sometimes is where we are doesn't necessarily match up with our biology.
Where it's supposed to be,
right? And so, but I mean, to your point, I love this attitude, and I'm a huge fan of, let's try this, let's see how we feel, and then let's kind of manage our way, or let's moderate it and tweak it until we find our happy place.
Yeah,
right?
No, absolutely. And one more thing, because it just popped into my head regarding kale. We raise rabbits for meat, right? And every so often we come across a plant. I'm like, can the rabbits eat that? And so we have to look it up. And we were, for a moment, I'm like, you know what? We could actually be growing kale, and not for us, but at least for the rabbits. And it turns out that, vets recommend against it because it's high in oxalates. I'm like, are you kidding me?
Rabbits.
So rabbits should not be eating it, but it's fine. It's a superfood for humans. It was hilarious when I saw it. I'm like, you gotta be kidding me.
Even rabbits can't eat it, for God's sake. What animal does eat kale, I wonder, other than bugs?
I have no idea. Maybe
that's
snails.
So interesting, right? That's kind of fascinating.
Yeah, and so yes, but I agree. You gotta figure out, and sometimes the problem is when you feel crappy, and that's your baseline, and you don't know what it really feels to feel good. It's sometimes difficult to judge, what makes you feel good or what makes you feel worse, because sometimes you can't feel any worse. You're already feeling so crappy that eating another donut is not going to make a difference, Well,
I think what we do, and that's a really good point, I think we normalize feeling crappy.
Yeah.
Right? Like people, you kind of have to live with the discomfort. And so for many people, being bloated, being in pain, being inflamed, that's just their normal.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, there's enough messaging out in the world that says, oh, you're feeling this way. Well, that's part of fill in the blank, aging, or whatever the case may be. And there's a certain acceptance of that, or there's a lack of understanding that you can feel better. I've always said that. I actually just said this to someone the other day, because I'd had a really bad headache for a day. I said, the best part of having a headache is when you don't have the headache anymore, because you feel so much better, right? Yeah. And you realize that, it just kind of elevates your experience. And so I think a big piece of the puzzle is helping people to understand that, if what symptoms are, and that they don't need to feel this way, and that there is a path to trying out different things. And I like to call paleo actually the gateway diet.
Yeah.
Because of all the things that we've talked about, it's the easiest to adopt, especially these days, because it's so common. There's so many people not eating grains. There's so many people who are trying to cut processed foods out. Unfortunately, the packaged goods industry has caught on, and you've got paleo this and paleo, lots of things out of boxes and bags that are paleo and keto and whatnot, but which probably at the end of the day don't serve us. Now, one of the other things that you talk about is homesteading. You as a family have made a decision.
Yes.
And maybe you want to talk about that a little bit, because I think that's it's not an easy path.
No, it's not.
It might be fun, but it's not an easy path. And I don't know if it's fun, but it's not easy.
It is very fulfilling, and it is a lot of fun as well, but it can also be stressful. And, especially if you do it on the side, farming is not my main job. I don't derive an income. Well, we sell some eggs on the side, but, that's not really paying the bills.
No.
But we realized that, we really want to have a full grip on our food supply, at least on the majority of the protein that we consume. I don't need to grow my avocados or plantains or what have you, but the core of what we need, what we eat every day, we want to be able to grow ourselves for several reasons. One is that, there are a lot of great brands and farms out there that do the right thing, but sometimes even they are limited in what it means to do the right thing. And I'm going to give you one simple example that is really a very drastic example of how you cannot get that type of food that I want to eat in the store, and that is chickens, right? First of all, humans have not been eating chickens for meat. We've been doing this for less than 100 years. Back in the days,
Really?
we would eat a chicken if it was the end of the chicken's egg laying career. So the chicken would end up in the pot, right? That's it. Low and slow, you cook it and, get the flavor, and you didn't cook it for the meat, for the tender, for the big breast. Let's put it that way, right? Meat birds, as they are called, are a relatively new phenomenon. And here is the thing, if you look at the ancestor of the chicken, the jungle fowl, it lays a couple of eggs a year. It has maybe 1.5 pounds. There is no meat on there, and it takes forever to reach that weight. So completely unsustainable from a farming perspective. Fast forward, we now have the Cornish cross, which was specifically bred to get from birth to butcher weight in 45 days. I mean, think about this. 45 days. That bird cannot reproduce. It's a dead end, basically. It cannot, towards the end, it cannot even walk. It cannot fly. It cannot sustain its weight on its, skeletal structure because it's so heavy. And you're basically slaughtering and eating an obese baby, with poor nutritional. But that's 99% of the chickens that you find anywhere. It doesn't really matter if you get it from from White Oak Pastures, for that matter, which is, a farm that I really like, and they're doing a lot of things very good. But there is no way around selling something else other than this chicken.
Yeah,
because it's not profitable. And it already costs, close to $40. If you want to raise a chicken well, you would pay $70 for the chicken. Nobody's going to pay $70 for a chicken, And so that was one of the things I'm like, okay, even if the kids in particular, like, chicken. And so what can we do? Well, we have to raise them ourselves, not be cost conscious really, but raise a breed that's faster growing, but not as fast as the Cornish cross. Feed it, low PUFA, no corn, no soy, organic, non-GMO feed. That's so expensive that no commercial farm would be able to do that. And then we have chickens that I'm willing to feed to my kids. Right. And we can only do that ourselves because I cannot buy those chickens anywhere, and it's less of an issue with ruminants. I mean, you can get grass-fed, grass-finished, regeneratively raised, beef from several places. But even then, if they're slaughtered in a USDA, certified butchering facility or processing facility, there are certain regulations, to that. Well, with the chickens, all the chickens are bathed in chlorine, before you get them. I don't want to have my chicken meat, exposed to chlorine, and that happens all the time when it's, a regular USDA chicken that you get in the store. Now with beef, it's a little bit different, but even so, the butcher cannot give away, certain organs. We talked about it before we, started recording. And so if I really want to do it the way I want to, what I think is best from a nutrition, best from an animal welfare perspective, and best from a nutritional perspective, I have to do it myself.
Yeah.
And so that was the main factor. But then also, food security, you mentioned it before, who knows, maybe in 5 years, there's going to be taxes on meat and it makes it even more expensive than it already is. Or, whatever the case might be, I don't want anyone to tell me, what I can eat. So I want to take, I want to be sure to control my own food supply. And that was one of, those two reasons really that drove us to saying, okay, we're going to start learning and starting, to raise some of the food. And now I think right now we have 100 chickens on the premises, 30 of which are going to end up as meat birds, in June. So not too in a distant future.
Chicken season is coming.
Yeah. We have rabbits that we raise for meat. We have honeybees, for honey. So those are our carbs. And we have geese, and we just purchased some property to raise also beef cattle and dairy cows and pigs, to fill in the gaps of all the other protein that we like to consume.
Wow. What part of the world are you in now?
North of Atlanta. So
okay,
central
so you're
North
in the
Georgia.
States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Nice. Yeah, no, I mean, it's everything you, I mean, I didn't get I don't know why I missed the chlorine bathing part. That's the one that freaks me out. I knew everything else. I tend to get my chicken from a farmer, and I know that those chickens are walking around until they're not. So
Right.
I'm pretty, like, I'm fairly confident we're not getting the tipping over part. And interestingly enough, from certain farms, organic farms in Canada that I buy from, you don't get the giant chicken breast. They're like these scrawny little tiny things,
Yeah,
which
that's a good sign. That means it's probably not a Cornish cross.
Yeah, but but then you look at the price and you're like, holy jump.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a pricey meat. And there's the whole idea actually around chicken. A lot of people debate whether or not chicken is a great food for us. They talk about chickens being descendants of dinosaurs versus, cows and pigs that are and even rabbits. How do you keep your children from getting attached to the rabbits? That's what I want to know.
Well, I think it's a matter of having a new litter every 45 days, and there is new cuteness, like on a revolving door kind of thing, In the beginning, I think it was the hardest actually with the chickens. When we had our first flock of egg layers, every chicken had a name. Oh. And then when the first one got killed by a hawk, everyone cried. Including me, And because you feel like you're kind of protect you're the ones who are supposed to protect the animals, and then you failed. But anyway, that's a different story. But along the lines, they have learned that even though we give them names. I mean, I think giving an animal a name is the greatest show of love and respect, even though that animal's life has an expiration date. But it's still, we still do. I mean, not with 100 chickens. I mean, maybe the kids do, but I would not remember, any of those names. But with our rabbits, at least we do. And they've, come to accept that, those animals serve a purpose, and they have the best life they can possibly have. I mean, whenever we have young rabbits, they're in bed with our kids, they're hopping around, they are getting cuddled and everything. And then, I don't know, maybe 16 weeks later, they're on the plate, and that's just what it is.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's an interesting perspective. And I think that, I came up with this line a long time ago when I stopped buying any animal protein from the grocery store, which was, I'll eat an animal that's had a happy life until the day that it didn't. I mean, we all will die.
Yeah.
And they are going to die at some point. And I know that to a certain percentage of people in the world, and even people listening to this, they're screaming at me right now saying, you're selfish, all this thing. But I think that, my belief is that there's a circle of life, and it's always been this way.
Yeah.
I think everybody's entitled to their beliefs. Where I think we're hitting a slippery slope right now is where you have a political agenda that seems to be driving. Yeah. And you alluded to it yourself, like it's really driving us towards a place where all of a sudden it's going to be wrong to eat meat, or it's not going to be available. And, you cannot, under any circumstances, there's no study on the planet that can put 6 ounces of meat against 6 ounces of any plant food. And have them be even close to nutritionally equivalent.
But you know what I always tell whenever there is a militant vegan or something that says, "Oh, I could never kill an animal." Raise your own vegetables, and see how many animals. And it doesn't have to be, a cow, but it's insects, it's snails, it's caterpillars, whatever you have to kill.
Even bunnies that eat your vegetables, just not your kale.
Right. I mean, maybe on a smaller home scale, I wouldn't necessarily go out and shoot, the bunny if it's, I would try to put a netting around or whatever. But caterpillars, snails, insects, even if you use organic or organically certified, like products to deter, insecticides, whatever, by definition, you're killing insects with that product. And we've noticed it ourselves. I mean, we are not huge, gardeners, but we do have a veggie garden. And, during certain times of the year, I pick, caterpillars every day off the tomato plant and feed them to the chicken. So I'm directly responsible for the caterpillar's demise, so I can have my tomatoes in a couple of weeks. And if you extrapolate it on a grander scale, if you look at what's happening when you plant soybeans or whatever, I mean, they till, that plot, they run through it, they kill every rodent that's in there. That's one of the reasons why, whenever you see that happening, crows follow closely because they know they're going to have a free meal, with all the dead animals that, turn up from the machinery. And then they're going to spray it, especially if it's a conventionally, grown produce, to make sure everything is dead except that one plant that's supposed to be in there. And then you tell me, that this is vegan. It's bullshit, what it is. There is no way of feeding ourselves without killing animals. At least the animals I kill, I eat, and they are not collateral damage. And so I think that whole, vegan argument defies any logic. I mean, I can see that you cute animals and everything, but at the end of the day, it's either the animal or it's you, and I pick me.
100%. No, I'm with you, and I do think that our health in many ways depends on it. I think that we tend to be healthier. Not everybody necessarily can or should exclude all plant foods.
Right.
And there may be some people that can thrive that way. I mean, I just had this conversation also with a guy who's a specialist in the microbiome, and, he owns a testing company. I said, what would be super interesting, I think, is to find 10 carnivores and test their microbiome to see because a lot of these people are thriving, right? So how are they different, and test their genetics and test their microbiome? Like, what's helping them to thrive on this diet, and then go find someone who's an omnivore and thriving in spite of the oxalates and the phytates and all the things that, the carnivore crowd would claim is killing you. Right. And we could probably find vegans, but the struggle I have with the vegan story is that if you go looking for a society of people, of indigenous people, I don't think you'll ever find any society that's fully vegan. No. I think that if at a minimum, they're going to eat bugs, if not fish and things like that.
There is no native tribe. And also I think that whole vegan thing is a modern luxury, because you can fly in supplements, you can have your tofu, whatever it is from all over the world to kind of piece and, together a diet that somewhat, keeps you alive. I don't think there is any vegan who truly thrives. I mean, they're either lying or they don't know what thriving means, in my opinion. I might be wrong. But if you really try to be vegan based on things that grow around you, good luck. Yeah. And only eat what's in season and regional.
Yeah. And that's the other thing I was going to say is maybe in certain climates you can get away with it a bit easier than in others. Yeah. But certainly, like in a climate where I am right now, where we barely see the sun for weeks at a time, A, it's not feasible, but B, you're lacking nutrients that are going to help you to make it through this. Yeah. So the other topic I wanted to talk to you about, because this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and I haven't had someone on the podcast to really jam on this with before, and that's this whole issue of organ meats, because we talk about muscle meats. Everybody loves a great ribeye. Who eats ribeye? We'll lay off the vegans for now. We love a great ribeye or whatever cut is your favorite. But the organ meats is where I think we really start to get into the true value in many ways of animal protein. Yeah. And you've gotten into that business, but even before you did that, like, let's talk a little bit about the organ meats and how you came to your position on this. Yeah.
At the end of the day, it's all about, there are macronutrients and there are micronutrients, right? And if we look at what's happening in nature, especially among, carnivorous or meat-leaning omnivores, you see that very often, they eat the organs first, why is that? Why would you eat the liver first or the heart or what have you, and then the muscle meat, or even leave then the muscle meat for, the hyenas or whatever, depending on where you are in the, in the hierarchy. If you're the apex or not, Yeah. And the second reason, if you look back at, again, human evolution, or our ancestors, if you believe that ever happened, then, you'll likely realize that there were certain milestones as part of, our evolution where we made significant jumps in brain size, in stature. And one of those significant milestones was, going from scavengers who would only have access to the muscle meat or whatever was left over from the apex predator to becoming an apex predator and having first access, to the fat, to the organs, etc. And that made a significant difference in human development. And I think that combined with what we see still today in nature and what we know about how nutrient dense organs are and how depleted our soils are, where we might not be getting, nutrients that we might have gotten maybe 200 years ago, from vegetables, from produce, from, whatever, from the soil, more generally speaking. I think it makes a lot of sense to include organ meats in whatever shape or form in your diet, just as a kind of as an insurance that you're getting all the micronutrients, the vitamins, the minerals, the enzymes, the coenzymes, peptides, whatever it is, into your diet so your body functions optimally. It's really as simple as I don't think it's a superfood per se, even though, liver is, if there is a superfood, I would say, liver is probably one of those.
I agree.
But at the end of the day, it's just a very nutrient dense type of food that we all can benefit from,
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm 100% with you. And I think that, and it wasn't that long ago that I learned, if you look at heart, it's very rich in CoQ10.
Right.
And, when we talk about vitamins and minerals, if we look at the liver, you're getting methylated Bs, you're getting your vitamin A, you're getting your vitamin, I think you're getting vitamin K in there. Like you're getting
K2, yeah. Mm-hmm.
K2, like a full complex of bioavailable vitamins that are exactly in the form that your body can assimilate, which really, it transcends what can come out of a bottle, out of a lab.
Right.
In many ways. And I've always believed, I don't know that anybody's truly looked at this because I don't know what's involved in the processing, but the bioregulator peptides that I talk about originate in organ meats of animals. And so there's, when you look, and I haven't spent enough time on your website, but I know that on websites where they sell organ supplements, you often see incredible testimonials of people who've had miraculous results and healing.
Yeah.
And they're surprised, like they didn't even expect it from using these organ supplements. And I'm like, there's, it's kind of like the proof is in the pudding here. Like it's pretty self-evident that these foods, which are, number one, as you said earlier, they're hard to get. And even if you can get them, a lot of people will flip their noses up at them and say, no, I can't even, not doing that. That they really move the needle in a way that very few things do. Yeah.
And, we've received those testimonials as well. And, when long before we started that company and started selling freeze-dried beef organ supplements, I saw those testimonials. I'm like, I'm not sure if I'm buying that, it's a multivitamin at the end of the day. But the problem is that so many people are truly deficient in a lot of those key micronutrients that, yes, it will make absolutely a dent in how they feel and function. Yeah. And, if you're already somewhat optimized or fairly optimized, I would put myself in that camp, and I start, consuming more liver. I'm not going to, notice in like 100% energy improvement or whatever, because I am already fairly where I want to be, right? But if it's someone who is already low in iron, low in B12, maybe they came from a, plant-based diet where they, didn't get enough of those micronutrients, and then suddenly they get the optimal amounts, they feel a significant difference, and so I think those testimonials are very much real. I don't know why, one of our customers would lie to us. There is not really anything that they don't have a benefit from doing that.
There's no prize.
We are paying them to, to leave a glaring testimonial. It's just the feedback we are getting. And I'm like, this is, on the one hand, it's great to see that you can make a difference, by just consuming, organs at the end of the day. And it doesn't even have to be, eat fresh if you have access to, that's probably the best way of doing it. But for those who don't want to, or whatever the reason might be, popping 4 capsules a day, is almost a no-brainer, If obviously, everything costs money and you kind of have to balance out your budget and how you want to spend that money. But, everything else being equal, most people, I would argue, have a benefit from adding organs, to their diet.
I agree. I think that frankly, any food-based supplement is going to bring us benefits that we're
Yeah.
not going to be able to get from synthetic supplements.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that even goes to, food-based vitamin C, for example, or if for whatever reason you feel that you need vitamin E, I can't remember the name, but vitamin E often is added to supplements as just one of the 8 forms of vitamin E that is
Right.
naturally occurring in nature.
Mhm.
I think it's a natto will give
Uh-huh.
you the whole spectrum, and it's a food.
Yeah.
Again, like it up levels the supplement to your body because it provides it to the body in a way that's like, oh, hey, I know you, haven't seen you in a
Right.
while, nice to see you, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And to your point with the organs, I think that so many of us have micronutrient deficiencies we don't realize, mostly because the body is really good at figuring out hacks around it.
Yeah, like if
Right?
you're low on calcium, you leach calcium from the bone. You might
Exactly.
notice later that you have, osteoporosis or, weak bones. But, until then, calcium levels are fine, not a deficiency, and,
Yeah.
and the other nuance, so that really is, you mentioned it already, but, the human body is fairly complex. It's not like a car engine where you add gasoline, and you're good, No, it needs, certain micronutrients can only be absorbed in the presence of other micronutrients. It doesn't matter how much calcium you have if you don't have the K2, to shuttle it into where it needs to go, and and all of that. So if you have whole food sources that contain the right amounts that humans have gotten used to as part of our existence,
Yeah.
that's what you need, and not a synthetic, pill that has like one thing or maybe a couple of things in forms that the body doesn't even understand. That it might be able to convert it into something, but by the time that has happened, the other one might have already been absorbed or washed out. If you're ever taking a traditional multivitamin and then you look at your urine and it's all bright yellow, where all that stuff is going, not into your cells.
Yeah, it's just complicated, right?
Yeah.
And to your point, I think the body's going to have to work harder, and some of it will get wasted, some of it might get used, but then you might use up something else to get there's always going to be a price.
Yeah.
And I think that when we're using food-based supplements, it takes care of a lot of the issues. Okay. Well, was there anything else we want to, I mean, there's so many, you have such I love your approach to this space, right? Because it's very much an experience-based
Yes.
approach.
Yeah.
And I really wish I would have been a fly. I need to interview your wife next to talk about those conversations. Next time you need to bring her on too.
Yeah, we'll do.
I need to meet her because just okay, fine. I'll just die young. It's fine. I'm good. No, don't worry. Just keep feeding me crackers. I'm fine. But then her ability to then turn around and lean into it and dig into it herself and come back. I think it's such an interesting journey that the two of you have traveled together.
Yeah. And there are then, funny enough, the whole topic of, homeschooling, usually I'm the one who brings, I'm at a conference or I see something, I watch a video, I'm like, hey, we have to do this, and so I'm usually the one, bringing in new ideas and disrupting the entire schedule and routine. But there are certain things like with, homeschooling where she's like, what, we should take the kids out of school, and we need to homeschool them because the way it's going with the, public education system, is not really in line with, what we believe to be, optimal education. And so, she is actually taking the lead on certain things, as well. So it's kind of it's still me more in the lead, but it's like a, back and forth kind of that has been working out really well and has brought us to where we are today. So
to me, it's partnership.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a reason you're married to each other.
That's right.
How many kids do you have?
2, 1 boy and a girl. Uh-huh.
Wow. And how old are they?
8 and 10.
Wow. And you're homeschooling. That's amazing.
Yes.
Yeah. It's a commitment, but I think that homeschooling is, it's such a rich experience for the whole family if you're the right family.
Yeah.
I don't believe that everybody's cut out to homeschool their kids. But I do think that if it's the kind of thing that can work for you, it can make for a very enriching family life. And maybe your kids learn more. I'm sure actually that kids learn more life skills.
Yeah.
in that setting than they will sitting in a classroom
Yeah. No,
repeating after me.
it's definitely. I mean, if I remember back, all the way through college, all the stuff that I learned, and I know nothing about it anymore because I've never had to use it. But the things that I really need, I didn't learn. Woodworking skills, for example. Now that I'm building, sheds and chicken coops and tractors and stuff, I wish someone would have told me how to use a miter saw, in high school, instead of me having to watch YouTube videos to figure it out. But yeah, and I think human nature is to learn and discover if you're not in the way of the discovery. You just watch the kids and let them lead the way. They tell you what they want to learn and you just support them. Make sure they know how to read and count, because otherwise they cannot use the information they see, right? But beyond that, everything else is really, up to them, what they want to learn and to what extent. I wish I had that. And I'm not complaining. I mean, I am where I am because of my upbringing.
You did all right.
But nevertheless, I'm hoping that we can, broaden their horizon a little bit so they can make the choice earlier that they really want to focus on the stuff that they enjoy doing rather than what someone tells them they should be doing,
Do you think they'll go to college?
I hope not.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, that'll be an interesting journey for all of you, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you never know. You never know. And thank God for, you just mentioned YouTube. I mean, the truth of the matter is that there is value to a lot of the things that we sometimes rail against.
Yes.
But it's finding that balance.
Yes.
Maybe.
Yeah. Blocking out the noise and really only consuming the things that bring you forward, that help you, and not the stuff that make you anxious and angry and what have you.
Yeah, exactly. Let's stay away from the anger. All right. Well, Michael, do you have any, I think that this has been a very refreshing conversation. And
thank you.
In the audience that tends to listen to this podcast is very focused on, as I said at the beginning, I think this whole aspect of longevity and vitality. And do you have any parting words of wisdom for them as they travel their own journeys? Really?
Yeah. I mean, I would try, maybe almost everything and see how it works for you. Always ask, what is, why is someone saying what they're saying? What is their goal and agenda? And you might figure out if something makes sense to you or not. But I think being conscious about the decisions you make, be it, the food you put into your body or, whatever else you do, I think is important. Just going in autopilot is a recipe for disaster. It's gonna lead to where we are right now with our society, where everyone is sick, or only 1 in 12 Americans are metabolically healthy. Absolutely ridiculous. So make conscious choices, try stuff out. If it doesn't work, move on. Don't be dogmatic about things. You'll figure out what's gonna work for you, but at least do something. Not doing anything, inaction, I think, is the worst thing you can do.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. How long do you think people should, just last question, how long do you think, like when you did paleo, how long did you follow that paleo diet before you started to feel, wow, you know what, this is working for me? Then you made your transition. I mean, sometimes you get signs right away, but sometimes I find people have a tendency to skip around.
Yeah. I think you want to give it, at least 90 days, sometimes even longer. It really depends on, what it is and what change you're looking for. But, you can feel great or terrible with anything, in the first couple of weeks, and it might not be a good indication of how good is it for you. You might going through a detox, and you feel terrible, but that's not because what you're doing is wrong. It's just because your body is responding and trying to get rid of all the stuff that you did, to it, up until that point. So I would give it a couple of months. Obviously, if you find someone who you trust and you can take shortcuts, you can maybe save a couple of, I've been trying to figure things out for the past 10 years or so. I would say, if I would meet my previous me, I would say, hey, jump to the animal base and start from there and then start modifying from there instead of having to go through, first vegan, paleo, whatever you want to go through, save the time, and start at a point where it makes sense. And you avoid the biggest mistakes, I guess. And I think the easiest way is to find someone who you trust, who seems to be doing really well. And just copy that for a while and see how it goes.
Yeah. I've always said that the best people tend to be agnostic. right? They're
Right.
not emotionally invested
Yeah.
in any one thing, and they're open to the possibility that different things are going to work for different people.
Yeah.
And that's generally a good place to start. But I
Yeah.
think that one thing we both agree on is this whole thing about the organ meats. I think that, I mean, if a vegan is a vegan not for emotional reasons and for other reasons, I think adding organ meats, even as a supplement, would
Yeah.
be transformative for them.
Yeah. We have a
And for the
couple of
rest of us.
plant-based customers who buy our product for exactly
Do
that
they?
reason.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, because sometimes people just can't bring themselves to eat meat, right?
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, maybe that's a journey they have to travel. But if they can bring themselves to take a couple of capsules, I would imagine that they feel the difference pretty fast.
Right. Yeah.
So,
I agree.
all right. So, Michael, why don't you tell people where they can find you, where they can find your work, and where they can find these amazing organ supplements, which I personally think are going to save the, is part of how we're going to save the world.
Right. If only saving the
Yeah.
world. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, michaelkummer.com is my blog. That's where I put out most of my written content. The Primal Shift podcast is where I talk about things that don't work for the blog. YouTube channel under my name. So if you look for Michael Kummer, if you're more interested in, seeing what we're doing on the homestead, we're raising animals and stuff, the kummerhomestead.com, as well as the Instagram and YouTube channels are a great resource to kind of tag along. And then shop.michaelkummer.com, so very easy to remember as well, is where you can find our freeze-dried beef organ supplements.
Love it. And we have a code for the listeners, NAT15. You can save 15% off your purchase. If you decide to take the leap. I know I'm going to be trying them because
I think if you combine that with a subscription that you don't have to stick to, and I'd love if you did, but you get actually a 10% discount with a subscription, and then you can add the code, and that means it gives you 25% of your first order. So
goal.
Stick with the subscription.
But stick with, but here's the thing, right? I think if you're confident to do that, it's because that people will feel the difference and they'll stick with it.
Yeah. It's been working out for us. Fortunately, we've been growing massively since we started, and we just regular shows as well, just trying to do better and deliver a product that's valuable at a reasonable price, and it's been working. So
I love it. Actually, okay, last question. Where are you sourcing your organs from? Because people will want to know. They'll be like, Nat, how could you not ask him?
Right. So right now we are still sourcing, like all the other premium organ meat supplement brands, from New Zealand. Yeah. So it's regeneratively raised, grass-fed, grass-finished, the whole shebang. But I'm actually in discussions with a domestic supplier. Wow. I always wanted to do domestic because I figured, it doesn't make sense to fly in, organ meat powder from the other side of the world to sell it in the US, and then in some cases sell it back to Australia, or to New Zealand, which is absolutely ridiculous from an environmental, impact perspective.
Sasquatch size, footprint. Yeah.
And so we are in discussion, and we're probably going to launch a separate line with domestic. They're also grass-fed, grass-finished. The only downside with domestic is in winter they have to eat hay, because there is no pasture in the continental United States where cattle can graze year round. But based on what we've seen so far from a nutrition perspective, it's very much in line with what we get out of New Zealand. So at some point we might completely switch over. But that's in the works, and I'm super excited about that.
That's awesome. All right. Yeah. Well, keep us posted. Thank you so much, Michael. It's been a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you.
This has been a great conversation.
Thanks. I appreciate it too. Bye-bye.